Welcome to Disciple Dojo. In this video, I want to share some of the books that I picked up last year at SBL. Those of you that saw the video where I went to the Society for Biblical Literature's annual meeting, you also saw that I brought home a whole suitcase full of books. And I've been able to get through most, not all of them. And rather than just reading them and putting them back on the shelf and let that being that, I thought, why don't I share some of my thoughts with people who are looking for stuff that they can read and study and learn from. And so I'm just going to talk about a few of them and give you some quick thoughts if you're looking for something to read, particularly if you're looking for something in the field of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, as well as biblical interpretation and some Hebrew language stuff. So let's talk about some books I read this year. James Hamilton's book, Typology, Understanding the Bible's Promise-Shaped Patterns. This is a book all about typology. Clearly, that's what the title says. And typology to me is a pretty fascinating subject of study. There were some interesting insights in this at times. I thought some of the things seemed a little forced. I thought he found chiasms where I'm not sure that they were actually chiasms. I thought some of the patterns, the fulfillments that he points out, I don't know. I wasn't quite convinced, but there were some interesting insights for what it's worth. I'm glad I read it. John Goldingay's book, Lost Letters to the 12 Prophets. I loved the premise. He took the minor prophets, the book of the 12 in the Hebrew Bible, and imagined what it would be like if someone back in their times were to write letters to them. So different officials, different representatives of various kings. So for example, we have a letter to Hosea from Ahaz ben Jotham, king of Judah. And it's just a hypothetical letter that Ahaz would have written to Hosea. And then all of the responses to the letters are words from the minor prophets. Very interesting concept, but Goldingay is an author who I find to be frustrating to read because he will make a point I think that's really good, but then he'll overlook something that I think is incredibly obvious about the text. He's a brilliant scholar. This was an interesting concept. It just left me kind of underwhelmed. I think I was very excited by what it was, and then actually reading the responses. Sometimes it was hard to connect the prophet's actual words to the letter that was written to them and how it flowed exactly. Some of his interpretations, it seems like sometimes he goes out of his way to avoid any messianic readings of the prophets. That's probably a generalization, but Goldingay is an author that he's, like I said, I wouldn't say a love-hate relationship because I don't hate anything I read by him, but I'm respectfully frustrated when I read Goldingay sometimes. So interesting book, though. Glad I read it. Next up was Text and Paratext, Book Order, Title, and Division as Keys to Biblical Interpretation. This was an interesting read because it examined what's called the paratext, all the stuff around the text of Scripture that wasn't original. So the titles of the books, the chapter divisions of the books, even how the verses are divided, even the canonical order in different traditions of the books. Just one example, the book of Ruth. If you read it after the Song of Songs, it may read one way. If you read it after Proverbs, which is the order in the Leningrad Codex, it reads differently because Proverbs ended with a chapter all about the Esheth Chayel, the woman of valor, the woman of strength. And then what do you have in Ruth? You have a real life example of a woman of strength. And there's only 2 times in the Old Testament, I believe, that term is used. So Gregory Goswell's book, Text and Paratext, it explored the significance of how we read the books, how they're ordered. It also had a good discussion about the chapter divisions, whether you go with the Masoretic chapter breaks, whether you go with the chapter breaks that Stephen Langdon put in, and what difference that makes. This was an interesting read. It's not a page turner by any means, but well, actually for a Bible nerd, it is something of a page turner. So very interesting book. I recommend checking it out. Next up is Robert Plummer's 40 Questions About Interpreting the Bible. This is a book in Kregel's series, 40 Questions About. I picked up a few others at SBL last year. I just haven't got a chance to read them yet. 40 Questions About Roman Catholicism, 40 Questions About Arminianism. This one, 40 Questions About Interpreting the Bible, this had to do with hermeneutics. So there were questions about text, canon, and translations. What is the Bible? How's the Bible organized? Who wrote the Bible? Does the Bible contain error? Who determined what books would be included in the Bible? Then there are questions related to interpretation, questions related to meaning, and then they drill into specific text. How do we identify literary genre? How do we interpret historical narratives? prophets? How do we interpret prophecy? How do we interpret typology? How do we interpret apocalyptic literature? And then practical or current issues. How can I lead a Bible study? How can I use the Bible in daily devotions? What does the Bible tell us about the future? And then the last one was interesting. What are some modern day trends in biblical interpretation? It didn't blow me away. I still probably, for the average reader, would recommend reading How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Stewart and Fee first. But as a follow-up, I thought this was good. And this does get into some questions that Fee and Stewart don't touch on. So this was an interesting book. It was worth reading for sure. Next up was Revelation Through Old Testament Eyes by Tremper Longman III. It's like Ben Witherington III. You have to say the third on it, or it's not legit. Tremper Longman III. So this is also from Kregel Academic, and it's a series of commentaries on New Testament books, specifically through the lens of the Old Testament. What is the Hebrew Bible background for, say, the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Mark, or in this case, Revelation? I picked this one up, one, because Revelation is my favorite New Testament book to teach and study, but also because more than almost any other book, except maybe Hebrews, Revelation draws the most from the Old Testament. It is impossible to interpret Revelation accurately, even remotely accurately, without a decent working knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. So Tremper Longman, Old Testament scholar, phenomenal Old Testament scholar, writes a commentary on Revelation specifically through the eyes of its Old Testament background. Great idea. The whole series that I've seen so far, I've looked through some of the one on Mark, some of the one on John. I read the introduction of this one and the first couple of chapters. It's a commentary, so I haven't sat and read through the whole thing cover to cover. Very good, very helpful, especially if you're a student of Revelation. I recommend it. And of course, I cannot not mention our good friend Carmen Imes's book, Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. This is her follow-up to Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. If you read that, I don't have to tell you how good of an author, how great of a scholar Carmen is. And we actually gave away copies of this here on the channel this year. If you haven't already read it, read it. It's fantastic, and it explores what does it mean to be made in God's image, the image of God. What is that? There's been a lot of people that have had a lot of ideas over the years about what it means. This is a fantastic entry into that discussion. Go read it. Book I'm currently reading at the moment. I'm only about a quarter of the way through this one, but very much enjoying it so far. It's called Reading the Prophets as Christian Scripture by Eric J. Tully. The tagline is A Literary, Canonical, and Theological Introduction. This is not just the minor prophets, this is all of the prophets. And it's like an Old Testament intro textbook, but just on the prophets. It's got timelines, so you can situate the prophets with the various kings and the different kingdoms, because that can get really confusing when you're interpreting the prophets. The pages are nice and thick, semi-glossy. They're laid out really well. It's beautifully laid out. There are diagrams, there are maps, photographs and figures, sidebar articles. It starts with what are covenants in the ancient Near East, because all of the prophets are acting as kind of like God's covenant lawyers. So it explains what is a covenant. It explains what is a prophet, what is prophecy, what about false prophets? How did you get from a prophetic word, which is what God gave, to the actual books, which is what we have? What's that process like? And then there are chapters on each of the prophetic books that go into a little more detail, but give an overview of that book. So like I said, I haven't read this cover to cover. I'm working my way through it, but I'm impressed with what I've read so far. If you are interested in the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, it's worth reading. Now, this book that I read by Gary Rendsburg called How the Bible is Written, this is the most technical of all of these. You need to know Hebrew to be able to make your way through this one. He doesn't do a lot of transliteration. I think there's some, but for the most part, this presumes that you can read Hebrew. But this is a book about Hebrew syntax, about literally how the Bible is written, not how was the Bible compiled, but literally how is it written? What styles are used? What are some of the literary features of the Hebrew Bible? And then he pretty exhaustively chronicles examples of each of the things that he's trying to point out in the text. That sounds vague. I'll give you an example. So he has a number of chapters, for instance, that deal with alliteration. All of these examples of how he argues the authors of Scripture are being very intentional with alliteration, repeating certain sounds in one word to the next. There are a number of chapters on repetition with variation, how the authors will say something almost the same way, but they'll put a little variation where you don't expect it. They may change a verb tense, or they may change the order of a list of things. And he does it in prose narratives, he does it in legal material, he does it in poetic and prophetic texts. He has a whole chapter on how the Bible uses vahine, behold. He has 2 chapters on wordplay in the Bible, one on wordplay in general, and then one on wordplay in names. His chapters on things like switching addressee, like who's being addressed. He has a chapter on switching style. There's a chapter on Israelian Hebrew, that is Hebrew from the northern kingdom of Israel, as opposed to Judean, the southern kingdom Hebrew. But to me, the heart of this book, and what's worth reading the whole book for, are chapters 21 and 22. And so in chapter 21, when was all this written? Rendsburg makes the case that the Torah, based on its style and some of the things that he's picking up in it, he dates it to around the 10th century. Then in chapter 22, he offers rebuttals to the widely held documentary hypothesis, which says that no, it was much later than that, centuries after that, before the Torah was written, and it was cobbled together from 4 different sources, maybe more, J, E, P, and D, and we can see the hands of the redactors. Rendsburg actually challenges that head on. He says, no, these books bear the mark of unified authorship, or at least from a very specific time period, which he puts to around 1000 BCE. Now, Rendsburg is a Jewish scholar, not a Christian believer. He does draw a lot of analogies from literature throughout the world, Greco-Roman literature, even later Shakespearean language. And he uses those as analogies for the kinds of things that he's pointing out in the text. So if you've had basic Hebrew and you can read the text, even if you aren't fluent in it, and I'm not fluent in Hebrew, it takes me a while to work my way through the text, but this was very interesting. So Hebrew Bible nerds, I recommend reading it, even if you aren't persuaded by his arguments. But if you enjoy the work of someone like Robert Alter and his translation of the Hebrew Bible, this is a similar vein, even if their conclusions don't agree with one another. In fact, Alter gives a plug on the back, the very first blurb. So read it, check it out. I'm glad I did, but this is not light reading, and you do have to know Hebrew in order to really get anything out of it. Another work that presupposes you'll know some Hebrew, although you could get the gist of it without being able to read the language. Andrew King, William Osborne, and Joshua Philpott edited The Law of the Prophets and the Writings, Studies in Evangelical Old Testament Hermeneutics in honor of Dwayne Garrett. This is a series of essays of the 3 parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Law of the Prophets and the Writings, by various students and colleagues of Dwayne Garrett over the years. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't always agree with every conclusion every time, but big surprise. That's what doing biblical studies consists of mostly. And even when I did disagree, I appreciated what I was reading. Now, the scholars and contributors to this would be openly conservative in their leanings. These are conservative evangelical Old Testament scholars. And so they do confront some of the sacred cows in Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholarship that are widely held among, say, more mainline or secular academic Hebrew Bible scholars. So whereas somebody like Rendsburg would say that the Torah was composed around the 10th century BCE, most of the contributors in here would probably say actually it was probably composed in the 15th to the 13th century BCE, around the time of Moses or one of his immediate successors. So a little bit different flavor in terms of the theological presuppositions, but I enjoyed this, and I do recommend it if you like reading biblical scholarship journal articles. This is just that collected in book form. And then lastly, we come to behind the scenes of the Old Testament, cultural, social, and historical contexts. This was edited by Jonathan S. Greer, John H. Wilbur, and John Walton. Of all the books that I read this year, this was not only the biggest, bulkiest, but it was also the best. Hands down. It is 66 essays, 66 chapters, and the rubric that it's written within, like a play. Like the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is like a play. So part 1, elements of the drama, the stage, and that's essays about historical geography. Then you have the sets and the props. Those are essays that have to do with archaeology. Then you have the scripts. These essays have to do with ancient Near East literature and literary backgrounds. Then you have the frames, and these have to do with ancient Near East iconography, images, inscriptions. Then you have part 2, acts and scenes of the drama. The essays have to do with acts, and these are integrated approaches to broad historical contexts. These would be essays having to do with things like the ancestral period, the Egyptian sojourn, the settlement period, the United Monarchy, the divided monarchy, and then scenes. These kind of drill down a little bit more specific, and these are essays that have to do with things like Akhenaten and the Amarna period, late Bronze Age collapse of the Sea Peoples migrations, the Battle of Karkar and the Assyrian aspirations. Then you have part 3, themes of the drama. And so the themes that you see throughout the Old Testament: God, family, sustenance, governance. So you have essays on slavery in the world of the Bible, the local economies of ancient Israel, metallurgy in the world of the Bible, ancient technologies of everyday life, law and legal systems in ancient Israel, warfare in the world of the Bible. This is just a wealth of good introductory material for any student of the Old Testament. This would also be helpful for students of the New Testament who don't always have a comprehensive view of the world of the Old Testament because they focus more on New Testament. Wherever you are, if the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is of interest to you, I absolutely recommend this resource. And I want to specifically point out the essays in it that I personally found the most either enjoyable, challenging, or profound. Essay 5, An Introduction to Biblical Archaeology. This was a great essay that literally introduces you to how biblical archaeology works, who the various figures are throughout the history of biblical archaeology, names that you come across in commentaries all the time, and then key findings in the history of biblical archaeology, things that kind of shook up the world of biblical studies. Chapter 19, An Introduction to Ancient Near East Iconography, an incredibly helpful chapter that deals with images from the ancient Near East, and it gives you examples. It shows different images, like what were idols, what were cylinder seals, what do we actually see when we look at them. These are things that get mentioned a lot of times in commentaries or journal articles, but not always with the actual pictures that they're talking about. And then chapter 22 was specifically Canaanite iconography. So images having to do with Baal or Baal, and it reproduces them so you can actually see what the image, the inscription, the iconography consists of. Chapter 42 was a good chapter, Interactions in the Ancient Cognitive Environment by John Walton. Now that's a very fancy worded chapter title, but it basically talks about the different ways that the Hebrew Bible interacts with the thought world of the ancient Near East. That's something that we've done the video series here on the channel, Backgrounds of the Bible. That series is all about what Walton talks about in this chapter, whether it's polemics, whether it's counter texts, whether it's echoes, and then it gives examples from Genesis 1, from Psalm 29, Psalm 74, Isaiah 4, the chaos serpent battle imagery that's found throughout. We've talked about that here on the channel, as well as the Tower of Babel and what it would have communicated in light of people familiar with ziggurats and various Babylonian claims. So that's a really, really, really good chapter. Chapter 44, also by Walton, The Temple in Context. And again, in that same playlist here on the channel, we've looked at what Walton covers in this chapter, the background of ancient temples, the symbolism, what the divine human relationship was considered to be in the ancient world, the significance of purity, clean, unclean. And then chapter 46, Roy Gain wrote about worship, sacrifice, and festivals in the ancient Near East. And this was a great chapter that dispelled some of the maybe false understandings that we, especially New Testament believers, have about sacrifices in ancient Israel. And it talked about the functions of the sacrifices and the festivities that surrounded them, and the concept of rituals of restoration that were ubiquitous throughout the ancient Near East and that we see reflected in the sacrifices of Israel. And then the last chapter I'll note that as of particular interest was chapter 51 by Carol Myers, Women in Ancient Israel. And this was a whole chapter on the roles of women within the home, within the household, within the workforce, reproductive activities, commercial activities, women in the social and even the political life of ancient Israel, the community roles women had. This chapter did a lot to upend some of the lazy stereotypes that cursory readings of the Bible will lead people to embrace. So there were 66 chapters. I found all of them helpful in some way, but those in particular I thought were worth mentioning. Of all the resources that we looked at in this video, this definitely would be my number one. Glad that I got it at SBL, glad that I carted this big boy home in my luggage, and glad that I read it. In terms of what Disciple Dojo is all about here on the channel and my own teaching leanings, this is my top pick of what I've read this year so far. So I hope this video has maybe spurred your interest to pick up some of these titles and check them out for yourself. I'll put links to each of them in the description below. I don't get any money for shilling for any of these at all. I don't have any affiliate links or anything where I get paid based on what you buy. This is solely just letting you know these are some things I've read this year. Here are my thoughts on them. Now, at least they're on your radar as well. That's all for now. If you appreciate videos like this, where we look at resources or any of our other videos here on the channel, the best way you can show us that you appreciate it is by subscribing and by sharing the channel with other people. As of right now, when I've made this video, we are only about 500 subscribers away from 10,000 subscribers. And when we hit that 10,000 mark, we are giving away the Anchor Bible Dictionary. This is just one of the 6 volumes that make it up. I just didn't want to lift up the other 5 just to hold them up and show you. This set is going to be given to a fortunate subscriber here in the channel. So the best way that you can be sure to know when that contest goes live after we've hit 10,000 is by subscribing and clicking the notifications icon as well. That lets you know whenever we have new Disciple Dojo content out, and it lets YouTube know that you want to see whenever we have new Disciple Dojo content out. Thank you for those who support this ministry. As always, stay tuned for more here at Disciple Dojo and keep training.